Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our HashiCorp webinar, where today our topic is assessing secrets management for DevOps. My name is Connor Beechnor, Senior Field Marketing Manager here at HashiCorp, and today I'm joined by our Senior Technology Specialist, Dan McTeer, who will be your presenter for this session. In terms of the agenda, Dan will be presenting for around 30-35 minutes today, where he'll be discussing the evaluation process of a Global 2000 company that eventually led to them adopting HashiCorp Vault as their preferred secrets management tool. After that, we'll then have a live Q&A session, so please submit any of your questions via the Q&A box provided. You can find that in the bottom right-hand corner of your presentation window, and we'll answer those at the end. Lastly, please note that this webinar is being recorded and we'll send a link to everyone later this week after it's been processed. So with that, over to you, Dan.
Hey, thanks, Connor, and thanks everybody for joining. I know it's kind of late in your day there, and so we appreciate you joining. My name is Dan McTeer. I joined HashiCorp just a bit over a year ago as a technology specialist. Previous to that, I was working at Adobe for almost 5 years, where I ran a team that was responsible for various security tools. Vault was one of those. And so we ran that for about 2.5 years by the time I had left. Previous to that, most of my experience is all in technical operations. So everything from network administration to system engineering, even to data center ops. And then a security background as far as my education goes. So let's talk real quick about what the problem was we were facing. When I was hired at Adobe, my first job was really to assess secrets management tools for a large business unit within Adobe. I worked initially for the digital marketing business unit. Most people don't know that Adobe has a digital marketing business unit, but this business unit is responsible for collecting more than 75% of all the digital marketing data across the globe. So this was a huge footprint, tons of infrastructure just everywhere. And what we had in place for secrets management just wasn't working. It wasn't scalable. It was fragmented. So Adobe as a company made entirely of acquisitions. Even Photoshop itself is an acquisition. So what we were kind of dealing with was multiple business units, 50 different products, and then hundreds of teams attached to each of those products. Everything from developing the desktop app for Photoshop to the mobile app for Photoshop, or even collecting statistics for Photoshop was a different team that made up that product. And so the problem we had was there was just a ton of disconnect. Each of these teams running different technical stacks, running different tools, not really communicating with each other. And one of the largest problems that resulted from this was when our security and compliance teams had to come in and evaluate a lot of these things going on. Even in cases where teams were using similar tools, they all had different deployments of those tools. And so just tons and tons of sprawl, not just from a secrets perspective, but also from a visibility perspective. So as I started evaluating what was best for the digital marketing business unit, I started looking at different costs, and these weren't just the cost of support contracts or the cost of running infrastructure behind a service or anything like that. This was all the other costs. And in most cases, these were the costs that were similar across tools, regardless of which tool we used. And so I started looking at the cost of support and training as far as teaching developers how to integrate with a tool, teaching GRC people how to evaluate audit logs for each of those tools, things like that. And then the cost of the workflows themselves. This was actually, things like building code and whatnot. And then from a scalability perspective, could I deploy this tool everywhere? Could it handle the sort of transactions that we were putting through our digital marketing business unit? We were totaling somewhere in the neighborhood of more than 100 trillion transactions on a yearly basis, digital marketing transactions. And to have a secrets management tool at the back end of that, it needed to be something that could handle that sort of workload. But there wasn't just that. In a lot of cases, you would see situations where a team would integrate their application with a particular tool in a particular way. But when they had to integrate with a different tool, they kind of had to change that process, change that workflow entirely. It wasn't just about changing code. It was about changing the whole way the process works just to integrate with that other tool. And so scalability means a few different things in this particular case. We had one team, for instance, who was deploying a new self-service portal for some of our external customers. In this particular use case, just for secrets management alone, in Azure, cost upwards of 3.6 million per month just to support secrets for that one platform. So here's kind of the hidden costs that I calculated, and this was based off of our experience onboarding people to Vault. And as we started looking at this across other tools as well, we started to see some patterns there. And this is typically what you would see: about 3 days worth of development to integrate with the tool, a day of training for each of the people who are going to use that tool, and then the ongoing cost of security evaluation plus compliance auditing and things like that. And so we started looking at what this cost for multiple tools. The pattern was usually one of two things. Every time we saw somebody adopt a new tool, it was either they wanted to do their own thing, they wanted to have full control of the service because that's what was easiest, that was most accessible to them, depending on the platform they were running in, or they wanted to pick a tool that met a specific need. And so they had a use case, they wanted to solve that use case, so they picked a secrets management tool that could solve that use case, not really giving any consideration to, what would happen 6 months down the road if another use case came up. And a lot of times when a new use case inevitably came up, they would have to figure out which tool they needed to use for that particular use case as well. And so you started to see some fragmentation there. And so the cost of adopting multiple tools, not standardizing essentially, would kind of grow out of control. And again, this wasn't the support cost or the infrastructure cost. It was just, having to adopt each one of these tools in different parts of your application. So just real quick, I'm just going to start with the Gartner definition of secrets management. Basically, credentials and secrets for software machines are programmatically managed and retrieved through APIs and SDKs. This is how Gartner evaluates a secrets management tool. This is how they define it. So I want to talk real quick about the kind of the major principles behind DevOps, just to kind of set the stage for how we set our evaluation criteria at Adobe. So first of all, the collaboration piece. As we've spoken about, the problem gets really fragmented in a lot of different ways. It's not even just secret sprawl, it's visibility sprawl and things like that. It's important to make sure that we're collaborating on tool sets for lots of different reasons to simplify all these different processes that are involved, especially when security is part of the picture. Agility means that we need fluidity in our changes. We need to be able to adapt to certain situations. There's all of the use cases that we have currently, and then there's all of the use cases that we will inevitably have as the future goes on. If we look back, over the last 20 years to see how much technology and platforms and providers have changed, we know that there's some level of certainty that those things will continue to change, and we'll need something that can adapt to that. And then, of course, the feedback loop. That's an integral part of DevOps. We need to be able to continually iterate and improve. These things allow us to continually strengthen our posture, our security posture, our reliability, and things like that. So here was kind of our criteria around those three principles. As far as the collaboration piece goes, it's critical to have an API that you can interact with. Initially, when even before we looked at Vault, the APIs for our existing tools were really lacking. We were CyberArk users and Thycotic users, and integrating with those two tools from an application proved extremely difficult, especially in some cases where we were integrating with SOAP APIs instead of REST APIs. Authentication, making sure we can integrate with our existing authentication mechanisms, whether it was a machine or a human being or something else that needed to authenticate to get secrets. And then, of course, auditing. We wanted to standardize auditing. We wanted to make that auditing flexible as well, so that it could be piped into our seams for security notables and things like that, but also so that we were taking our GRC staff, for instance, who historically hadn't been technical or didn't need to be technical, and making sure that they only needed to focus on and understand a single specific set of logs to know what was going on with secrets management. Agility. Control is one of the first things that comes to mind. As somebody who's provided shared services for 20 years for lots of different global companies, I need the ability to really truly control that service from start to finish. I met with one of our customers late last year who told me this story about how this was a big retail customer in the US here. And they told me about this secrets management tool that they were using. And back in March of last year, they had this major outage on their website, which seriously impacted their sales. And as they started digging into it, they noticed that it was a bug in their secrets management tool that was causing the problem. And so they called the vendor to discuss how they could remediate this. And the vendor's model, their typical model, is to send professional services to solve these problems. And so they told them the soonest they could get out is July of that year. And so essentially they expected the customer to wait 4 months before they could come out and help resolve the problem for them, which is just completely unacceptable. It's important that whatever tool you use, you can upgrade when you need to without help. You can move things around. You can get resolution for bugs quickly and easily without needing somebody to show up. Deployment as an operator, I need that to be as simple as it is to integrate with the tool and consume it from a user perspective. And so being able to build automation that can allow me to deploy in regions or different places or different situations is extremely important in this picture. And then, of course, adaptation. We were about 1.5 years in, and there's going to be a lot of this. You're going to hear about findings that we had after the fact, after we deployed Vault. But this is one of those great stories. We had to deploy infrastructure in China on behalf of some of our customers. They needed to gather digital marketing data in China for one reason or another. And so we had to deploy in both Azure and AWS in China. And if anybody's been through that experience, they'll understand those APIs for those clouds, at least, are multiple versions behind where they are in the rest of the world. And so what we were looking at is a lot of our automated processes that we had built out and no longer worked in China once we moved over there. But Vault was that one thing that was completely standard, completely good, because we were able to take the binaries that we used everywhere else in the world and deploy those in China. The secrets management experience, especially in a place where secrets management and security is so critical, we were able to deploy those same Vault binaries and give that consistent experience to our users there in China. So that was a huge win, being able to adapt like that, especially in those kind of circumstances. And then, of course, feedback. Service changes, I need to be able to, again, iterate on my service. I need to be able to improve that, especially when it's newly deployed. I need to be able to make improvements as quickly as my consumers, my users are feeding that feedback into me. And then service health, we were a big believer in not just monitoring ourselves, but allowing our customers, our internal users, to monitor the service health as well. We had a bunch of SLAs that we had committed to, and we wanted to make sure we were being transparent with our users in those SLAs. And so it should be simple for everybody involved, consumer and operator, to see what's going on with the service. And then responsive support, I'm not just talking about my team on that, I'm talking about the vendor that you pick to work with. They should be available to solve your problems immediately, at any time. It doesn't matter when. What you need to have somebody that sees your business as critical as you do, and responds accordingly. So just some other considerations really quick. Scalability, again, isn't just about growing in presence or number of transactions. In our case, it was about response time. We were required to respond with secrets requests in under 50 milliseconds, things like that. But again, it's about how well you can move use cases around, and especially how well you can adapt to the new use cases, as well as you're able to accommodate the existing use cases. Usability is generally a spectrum between user friendliness and flexibility. It's a hard spectrum to find the right place on. You may see a lot of tools, for instance, that are simple to use, but are limited in their use case support, things like that. But for the most part, you want to make sure that you're adapting to as many use cases as possible. You can accommodate as many use cases as possible on a single tool, or that the tool itself is built in a way that's flexible enough to accommodate as many of those as possible. And then I want to talk about this real quick. PAM I'm one of those who are sort of vocal about PAM. We did have a number of PAM mechanisms at Adobe for different scenarios, and just to define what PAM is, to me, this includes privileged secrets management. This could be rotating static credentials, it could be generating dynamic credentials, and then there's the privilege escalation element, and then the session recording element. In my mind, the way DevOps is moving and the way the industry is moving in general is heavy on the automation side. And when you think about why a particular person would need to log into a host or some other thing with privileged access rights, those things are generally limited to things like installs or upgrades or configuration management or troubleshooting. And based on tools available these days, at this point, good automation processes can be built around those to the extent that we shouldn't need to, as human beings, log into machines anymore. In fact, we were moving in a direction where simply logging in as root to a host would have thrown a security notable and got you a phone call from the security team to see what you were doing. And so many of these things nowadays can be automated. They can be very well defined, and those processes will do exactly what they're instructed to do. They don't feel emotion. They don't feel compelled to do something criminal once they log into production or anything like that. And that's really the way the industry is moving. And so I would expect to see PAM lose a lot of its relevance as we start to see more automation around that and more audit log trails around that, versus having a session recorded when somebody escalates privileges. But with that being said, HashiCorp is developing a PAM product because we know that a lot of you may still need to accommodate certain regulations until that time comes. And so that's going to be in more of a controlled kind of POC with a few customers later this year. And then you'll see that more in a general release towards the middle of next year, I would expect. So let's talk real quick about why we picked Vault. Basically, we recognized that it could handle all the use cases that we had in existence at Adobe at the time. But not just that, we recognized that it had the potential to adapt to many of the new use cases coming along. And there were plenty of new use cases coming along where we were able to sit down with those teams, discuss those new use cases, and sure enough, find a way to integrate that with Vault. Again, we saw it adapt to things like China and simplify the deployment there. And then, there were other use cases that one in particular I'll talk about later too, that were a huge testament to our choice there. Is Vault always the perfect match? No, but nothing is. I have yet to see a problem though, in my own experience, that Vault couldn't solve, just because it is so flexible. But I would say the biggest advantage here that we didn't really realize again until after we deployed it was that our users wanted to use Vault. HashiCorp itself has a reputation because the tools are built by practitioners for practitioners. If anybody else here has been involved in deploying security tools and getting people to adopt those, they know how difficult that is in general for security tools. And so the fact that people were showing up at our door asking to use Vault, because Vault was designed around their specific needs and by people in their shoes, it was hugely successful just because of that. And then, of course, for those who haven't heard the news, Gartner, based on their new secrets management category, has ranked Vault #1 in secrets management against all the other tools that have existed for secrets management since that was a thing. So huge news there. Big testament again to how great the tool is. So I do get asked often about build versus buy. This is something that I'm super passionate about, again, as somebody who provides shared services, who has to ask for budget and things like that. I often get asked by executives, can't you just build it? I did have a fairly large team that I managed. I had 21 direct reports. Half of those were in Romania, half in the US. I did have a few developers on that team, but they were kind of busy with an open source project that we had going on. But we did take a stab at it. Really, at the time that we bought Vault Enterprise, the only feature that was available that we really cared about was replication. And of course, this was beginning of 2017. There are a ton of features that we obviously care about now, but that was really the only one back then. And so what I did was I had 2 people plus half a person, well, somebody spending half their time basically developing replication for close to a year and a half. And in that year and a half, we were probably about 80–85% of the way there. We had built a pretty good mechanism to handle replication between clusters. However, as we started to kind of peel back the layers of the onion, we started to notice security issues with that, which would have caused the staff to go back into development for probably another 5 to 6 months. And keep in mind, this was just to develop the feature. We would have had to deal with a lot of other things on top of that, just ongoing, once we had the feature finished. And so this costed me, as far as employee hours go, this costed me somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 to 300K over that year and a half. I basically had to call it, I had to scrap it at that point. To kind of shift focus to other things. It was obvious, this wasn't going to work well, but at least I could go back to my management and say we gave it a good shot, right? So this is reality. This is what actually goes into developing Vault. There are 22 or more, I'm pretty sure it's 24, 25 at this point, full-time developers that focus just on the core of Vault. We have over 800 contributors on GitHub who contribute to the open source project. I believe there's actually 5 product managers now that focus on different aspects of Vault, anything from the core pieces to the GUI to Splunk integrations now. And then more than 450 enterprise customers who are funneling back feature requests and bug bug reports, things like that, that help us continually improve Vault. So there is a lot of effort that goes into developing Vault, but just kind of on top of that, here's kind of what you're getting into. You know, let's say you do have the employees to build something yourself. If you go down that route, this is kind of what you're looking at as far as ongoing support of that, right? You develop the initial feature, but then you're kind of on the hook for ongoing maintenance. You have security processes in place, such as static code analysis or pen testing of the solution. This is a security tool. This is kind of the core of everything. And then, of course, your accreditation processes, either for GDPR or FedRAMP in the US, things like that. There is a lot on the line, especially when it comes to secrets management, because as we all know, data breaches these days are not a joke. And so this is a big deal. This isn't just a typical internal application to accommodate some other need that users have. This is secrets management. It's a big deal. So just some things to consider if you're looking at that option. So as far as Vault versus Cloud goes, this is one of the most interesting stories that happened in my experience at Adobe. We had a team that was onboarding to Vault, and this team was a managed service branch of our digital marketing business unit. And so they were servicing some of the biggest names in the industry, huge names. And so what they would do is Adobe digital marketing software is notoriously difficult to implement, but it's still the best in the world, in my opinion. And so they would basically pay this managed services branch to deploy the software for them, and then they would come in and look at the data as it was being collected. So we were migrating this team over to Vault, and we had failed to gather as much data as we could have as they were onboarding. And so basically what they were doing is they had this very autonomous environment that was very locked down because it was accessible by both customers and internal employees. So it had to be isolated from everything else, and it was running in AWS. And so as we were onboarding them to Vault, what we found out kind of after the fact was each of these hosts had 250 plus unique accounts on them. It was standard usernames across the board, but each of those users had different credentials for each host to really kind of prevent, you know, a security incident from spreading if one of the hosts was compromised. And so as they would spin up a host, they would spin up these credentials. They would be unique to that host. And so as you can imagine, over 10,000 hosts, we ended up with millions of secrets sitting in Vault. The cool thing is the service handled that very, very well, although we didn't really want them using that as a use case. And so we ended up developing a better way for them to handle that use case, but it took us 9 months to clean that up. The cool thing is that it didn't really cost us any extra to have that happen in Vault. If they had used something like AWS KMS and made that mistake, that would have cost us over $2.4 million per month just to store the secrets. That's not the transactions after the fact. And so over that 9-month period, as we clean that up, that would have cost upwards of $20 million just for that one use case, which would have paid for our Vault support contract for many, many years. And so that was a huge win. That's one that I often talk to people about and that people don't often consider, right? It's usually like this open credit card and you go spend and somebody else just pays the bill. And that's a lot of the times how operators look at it. So just something to keep in mind when you're considering, you know, using Vault versus using something cloud native. So just real quick, as far as supporting Vault goes, just a quick plug for a shared service side. It's always good to have a central group that are experts on the service so everybody knows who to ask for help. It increases efficiency and productivity. It gives your SREs more time to focus on their particular product versus having to know yet another part of the stack that they have to be experts on. And then the community that it built, especially as we grew and matured, there were thousands of people at Adobe at the time that I left that knew how to use Vault. And a lot of times in our support channels, for instance, in Slack, those people were helping each other. there was very little we had to do towards the end there as far as helping users understand how to use Vault. So here was my team composition, just to give you an idea. In that first year, I had 2 employees, one each in the US and Romania, and then I had a contractor. And those people would be responsible for managing the service and onboarding. And that's where we onboarded most of the digital marketing business unit in that first year. And the second year is kind of when we were asked by our CSO to expand that out to the rest of Adobe. And so we added 3 more full-time people to help accommodate that. At this point, the Vault team at Adobe is about, I believe, 6 full-time people total, and a couple of contractors helping out with that. My recommendation is for every 15 to 20 teams, you have one person helping to support the solution. A lot of the times you run into either system administration issues or you're answering questions for people who don't understand how to use Vault. And so that's a pretty good ratio to allow your team to support the tool, but also, work on tool improvements and things like that as well. A lot of times I get asked, what's the ratio for applications? The reality is it's still kind of a team structure that supports the applications. And so whether that team is supporting 1 application or 50 applications, it doesn't really matter. You train the team once, you support the team once, and then they know how to apply that to all their applications, generally speaking. So just real quick, this is kind of who I hired. I would hire one of these SREs, and this is kind of a list of their skills. And I'm going to kind of briefly go over these. You can pull them back up in the recording later if you prefer. And then I would hire what I call the senior DevOps engineer. This was mostly somebody who was good with development, but still understood some of the system administration side. And then I would fill out the rest of the team with what I refer to as the DevOps engineer, which is really just a junior level person with a good mix of both of those parts of experience. And here's kind of how I sorted out the roles and responsibilities. The easiest way to think about it was the junior level people were kind of tier 1, troubleshooting, onboarding, all that sort of thing. The 2 senior people were there to provide mentorship, guidance on building out the service, all those sorts of things. And tier 2 support, obviously, some of the more complex issues they would deal with. So just to recap, it's good to have standards as long as they're flexible, but it is possible to consolidate on those standards. It doesn't seem like it, but again, there is not a single use case we ran into that Vault could not solve. And so having a standard in place, so you have to write one set of code or deploy in one single service, things like that is huge, not just for limiting the amount of work that your employees have to do to integrate with secrets, but also limiting the amount of work that your security and GRC folks have to do to get visibility into the service as well. Adaptation, of course, I can't say enough about how easy Vault was to deploy in multiple environments and multiple scenarios, providers, things like that. There wasn't a technology stack that it couldn't integrate with. And so Vault is highly, highly, highly adaptable. And then, of course, the support team. The reason I want to emphasize this at the end here is the support team makes a huge difference. Make sure you're using SREs, system administrators, software developers, things like that. Your users will appreciate somebody who's been in their shoes, that can empathize with them, that can really give them solid advice on how to integrate with a tool like this. And will go a long way in building trust in the service that will drive adoption. Cool. So we'll end there and take questions. Thanks again, everybody, for coming. And yeah, I appreciate your time.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dan. So we do have a couple of questions that have come through. And just a reminder, if you do have any, please submit those in the Q&A box at the bottom. So just from the top, do you have any advice or best practices for training?
Yeah, actually, we actually wrote a whole training program. So sorry, I'm not sure how much time I have. What we did was we partnered with HashiCorp. We basically got the Vault 101 slides from them that they present at HashiCorp. And we kind of baked in our own little Adobe parts of that. And every 6 months, we would set up a registration form and allow people to register for in-person training. And then we would send out email reminders, things like that. The night before, we would use a Terraform template and build a lab environment for all the attendees, and then they would show up and we would do in-person hands-on training for 8 hours. In addition, we would record that training, edit it later, and then put it on our internal learning management system so that people could kind of follow along at their own pace. And then over the course of probably a year and a half, we trained over 1,000 internal employees on how to use Vault. And I would say, as far as, you know, successes go, that was one of the most successful things that we did. In fact, sometimes within a couple of hours of that ending, we would see those same people in our Slack channels answering questions for other new users. And so it really, you know, just cut down on our support workload. So great. Yeah, great question.
Cool. Yeah, we're fine for time, by the way, Dan.
Okay.
The next question is, do you have a rule of thumb regarding SLAs and how often you will not sleep too much during the first year due to the issues?
Yeah, so as far as SLAs go, I generally, especially if I'm using a cloud provider, I generally stick with their SLAs or the underlying network availability, which in my experience has mostly been 3 nines. So for instance, if Azure only guarantees that they'll provide 3 nines SLA for you know, their virtual instances, for instance, I know that I can't guarantee more than that, right? And so that will kind of be my minimum. But I do have, you know, there was a best practice that we frequently provided our users as far as, you know, building out code in their application to be aware of multiple Vault clusters. We did use performance replication. And so in our case, you could, if a Vault cluster went down, an application would know, would be aware that that cluster was down, and it could try a different cluster to get the secret that it needed automatically. And this is really just a difference of about 20 lines of code. And I do have a Medium blog posted on this with some actual code snippets for examples if people are interested in that. So even regardless of what you can do with the infrastructure SLA, there are things you can do to kind of improve the SLA beyond that by making changes in code or things like that. So.
Okay, fantastic. Next one is, how long should a company calculate to adopt the first 100 to 500 microservices in weeks?
So this is a difficult one because the reason we were able to onboard so many people in that part of Adobe so quickly in that first year was because I would say that user base was a little more savvy when it came to DevOps practices and automation. And so there wasn't a lot of training required to teach them how to use Vault or integrate with Vault. And so that happened really quickly and easily. It's going to depend a lot on your user base and their level of familiarity with these sorts of practices. But I would say, as a general rule, I would limit it to 100 and not more than that in that first year, because Vault really is a new type of tool. Again, it was built by the practitioner for the practitioner. All these other tools that you've seen previously were built by security people, which is great. You know, they definitely are the experts on security, but they aren't necessarily the experts on how on DevOps processes, for instance. And so a lot of the times you see users look at these tools and say, this won't work for anything that I do because X. And so keep in mind that this is a different kind of tool. There are going to be different challenges with it that the operations team faces. There's going to be different challenges that the users face. And so it's good to just keep it small in that first year, especially just so as you're both learning, so you kind of get a feel for what you should and shouldn't be doing. So.
Yeah, and I think a nice follow-on question to that is, are there any patterns that you see for success or failure specifically that we could learn from?
Yes. So, back to that Vault versus cloud scenario, that one incident was single-handedly responsible for us implementing an onboarding meeting. And usually this runs kind of counter to the whole DevOps thing, right? Because we want automation, we want self-service, things like that. And so what we did was we incorporated this onboarding meeting because we started to recognize that some teams just weren't familiar with these practices. And so what we did there was we required 15 to 30 minutes. If you've never used Vault before, that was our opportunity to sit down with you, get some of your expectations as far as the SLA goes, but also listen to your use cases and listen to your plans on how to build those use cases out according to Vault integration. And that was our opportunity to say, yeah, that's a great idea, or no, please don't do that, do it this way. And so I would say, the training was awesome. We had some lunch and learn, some brown bags, things like that, but the onboarding meeting was a really fantastic catch-all for preventing any big problems. I mean, generally speaking, the problems that we ran into that we were having to solve were created by the users, just not being careful. And so those onboarding meetings will go a long way to making sure that all your users understand how to use Vault. So.
Yeah, and I think just again, building on that slightly further, another question's come through that's asking, are there any how-tos that specifically provide to customers from the beginning, and then retrospectively, if you would do it again, what how-tos would be your must-haves? So for example, how to couple a Java Spring app with Vault.
Definitely. So there were 3 pieces of documentation that we provided our users. So I want to preface this by saying we have a lot of really amazing resources on learn.hashicorp.com if people have the time for that sort of thing. If you don't, our 3 main pieces of documentation were first a quick start guide. This was here's how you authenticate, here's how you store a secret, here's how you retrieve a secret, all those sorts of things. Just get people started in 15 to 20 minutes. The second piece of documentation was our best practice documentation, which outlined some different things. One of those, for instance, was the piece of code that I talked about to improve availability, for instance. Another one would have been, making sure people set TTLs with their tokens, things like that. And then our third piece of documentation was our example documentation. So we actually did have snippets of code written in Python and in Java that we would list out on our internal wiki, so that people could go look and see, how they authenticate with Vault to get a token, how they use that token to get a secret, how they would use that secret in their application, so on and so forth. So those 3 pieces of documentation were some of the best tools we had available to our users to help them get started in the right way.
Fantastic. What are the security guarantees that almost guarantee the secrets are safe when using HashiCorp Vault?
So I don't usually answer those sorts of questions. Is there one of the salespeople on, or one of the sales engineers that can answer that? I'm not sure. I know with our own contract, we had certain, with our own HashiCorp support contract, we had certain guarantees in there, but I can't really talk specifically about those on this call, unfortunately. But I'm certain there's somebody here that can answer that question. So.
No problem. We can follow up with them afterwards. Not a problem. Whilst at Adobe, were you using any other products alongside HashiCorp Vault?
Sorry, specifically for secrets management or something else?
Just in general. So aside from Vault, were there any HashiCorp tools that you were using alongside that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We were heavy users of Vagrant and Terraform. So.
Perfect. When deploying Vault on Kubernetes, is that the best approach, or any other architecture suggestions to run production scale of 10,000 users?
Yeah, so there is still a lot of concern and question as far as security goes around running Vault in Kubernetes, enough to say, I still wouldn't necessarily recommend it yet. In my mind, at the very least, you would probably run the Vault service on a separate cluster of containers and a separate implementation of Kubernetes, just to make sure that it's isolated from everything else. There are security and operational reasons for doing that, but if you're going to do that, then it's probably best just to run it on separate hosts, period, rather than putting Kubernetes in there and complicating it at all. I have seen people use scale sets in AWS and things like that to help it scale out. So just to put some context around it, our service was used by over 6,500 developers. At this point in time, there are over 700,000 containers and 200,000 standalone instances that are using Vault at Adobe. So, again, we're using standalone clusters, and it was handling that quite well. So you may or may not even need to worry about containerization at all. You'd be surprised about how well Vault can handle that heavy transaction side. So.
Great. And the last question is, what is the best practice to handle the rotation of keys on Vault?
So I don't know that we have a best practice, and we try and avoid weighing in necessarily on best security practices in some cases, because a lot of the time it has to do with what industry you're a part of or what your own legal department or security department has defined should be done. So most people are okay with a 90-day rotation, which is kind of what we did. But the rotating keys on Vault, depending on which keys you're talking about, whether that's the master keys that encrypt all the data inside Vault or something else, it's such an easy process. You could build some automation to do that on a daily basis if you wanted to. It's so simple. So it's just kind of up to what your business and your legal department and your security department define should be used. So.
Perfect. Good stuff. All right. Well, with that, we will conclude today's webinar. Any other last minute questions we can handle offline. But Dan, thank you so much for this session today. Really interesting. And everyone, as I mentioned at the beginning, this session was recorded and we'll make that available on our website, and I'll send a link via email as well. As Dan mentioned, if you liked what you heard today and you want to start exploring Vault, I really encourage you to check out our Learn site. And you can find that at learn.hashicorp.com/Vault. So with that, I hope you enjoyed today's session, and thank you so much for joining us. Goodbye, everyone.